Hey everyone, Baz the Healer here, and today we have a bunch of Season 2 Mythic Plus tips for all of you. And I say we because it comes from my comment section. I asked everyone for what packs and bosses they were struggling with. I have a nice little list here. We're gonna go kind of quick today, so feel free to rewind as needed. And of course, if you like healer content, get subscribed. There's a lot more coming. Let's dive into it. Starting off with Halls of Infusion, we got the first boss. There is a little heal check with a damage over time you have to heal through. There's a tank frontal that can hit you if you're not careful. And of course, there are chasers that happen. So just make sure if there's any mechanic overlaps that you are not standing still when dropping something. But speaking of dropping something, that magic debuff that drops the puddle, you're going to want to stack with other players. It doesn't do any extra damage to stack it. However, the real damage from this comes from the floor itself and walking on it. So use your movement skills to get out. In phase 1, this shouldn't hurt too bad. You should heal people through it just fine. But on phase 2, this can actually be a bit of a nightmare depending on how long your intermission took. So this is where my emergency cooldowns tend to go. How do you deal with the frogs and their stacking poison? Well, that's kind of the fun part. It's not really your problem unless you have a poison dispel. This is a poison dispel mechanic, so make sure you have one in your party. Help people out the best you can, or I try to stop stacks around 5 or 6 stacks, but realistically, this is sort of a crowd control and burn down the mobs deal. So make sure, even as a ranged healer, that you move into melee with everyone else, and you try to stack the frogs together, CC them, and then move away accordingly. These pulls can get messy, and it's up to players to check their own stacks for when they need to absolutely book it and run away from the frogs. The next request is for dragon pulls, but I do want to note first, the second boss, if you've ever struggled with this boss, just do the Alguthar Academy strat. You're going to stack on top of the tank, and then when the frogs come down, just run to the left. This super duper trivializes the fight and makes things a lot easier. So as for those dragons, there's 2 things that make them a problem. The magic debuff that goes on everyone, you just need to dispel yourself and heal other people, but it does count as a slow, so things like Freedom and Tiger's Lust should get rid of it. Having a Shadow Priest on fortified weeks can be a blessing here, and if you're a Discipline or Holy Priest yourself, this is a great time to grab that Mass Dispel talent that makes it a shorter cooldown so that you can move through these dragons a little bit easier. There's also the tank frontal. It's a breath. They can't dodge the frontal by moving left and right as it tracks, but they can actually outrange it. So if you see your tank getting blasted, let them know that they can outrange the move, and they should be Gucci from then on out. Now I want to talk about Vortex Pinnacle, but this also applies to the Halls of Infusion third boss, and that's how do you deal with these massive damage over time bosses where they're sort of a long heal check. So some classes have no issue, like a Mistweaver, and I hear as well with Druid, some of these fights are kind of brain dead and very easy to heal through. But for certain classes that are a bit more cooldown focused, like Preservation Evoker, my honest advice is don't overheal and use all of your cooldowns. Both of these bosses are positioned in a place in the dungeon where you can get away with using your bigger cooldowns and just layer everything the best you can. So for preservation players, use your stasis and your temporal anomaly essentially on cooldown to help heal people, and feel free to even use things like your living flame to top people off when you're running out of resources. It's a hard fight, but if you get used to the idea of spreading out your cooldowns and trying to never overlap or overheal something, you'll honestly be fine in most situations. They just take a little bit of getting used to. For Vortex Pinnacle though, in particular, if you have to take the tornado to jump, try to save some of your instant healing cooldowns that can be cast while moving, and even use things such as lock rocks and health stones when you get hit by the tornado to help deal with the damage. Make sure you're also standing upwind, as you take more damage from the dot when you're downwind, and the haste buff from standing upwind will actually really help with healing. Preservation players, you can actually pop hover and then use Emerald Communion and launch yourself into the sky, and it looks really funny and it's also really effective. Okay, I have 2 pieces of advice for Brackenhide Hollow. I got requested for the first boss, and the first boss has a nasty dot that gets put on every single target right at the start. Use your emergency cooldowns and big buttons here to try to heal everyone up to full, because unless they get past 90% HP, the damage over time effect will remain on them, and it is a bit too heavy to keep up on all your allies, so please, please, please heal through this. A health pot on the first tick can actually just save a life, so you might even use this on yourself to negate the mechanic, and your teammates can do this to make your life a little bit easier as well. At any point in time, if someone loses 10% of their HP, there's a buff that goes on the bosses, and I can't remember if it's attack speed or spell speed, but just try to keep people topped up in this fight generally. Try to bait the whirlwinds away from the party or the blade storms. However, this can be rather difficult. Just use caution and make sure you're not standing in the blade storm. However, there is a 3-parter on this boss that's pretty interesting. One DPS will get targeted by a charge from one of the bosses. then you're going to be turned into a small critter from a totem that gets dropped. And then the tank is going to eat a magic spell that you can dispel, but it'll keep them disoriented. This is spell reflectable. You need the DPS to take out the totem so that you can dispel the tank so that they can stand in the way of the charge and prevent the player from dying. There are other methods of dealing with this, but that seems to be the developer intended strat. So if your team's yelling for a dispel, tell them to kill the totem so that you can get the dispel off. I got another comment about how do I go left on Brackenhide Hollow, and the answer is please don't go left. Plead with your tank not to go left. Do everything in your power to not go left. It just hurts way more than right side by a ton, and if you're forced to do this because your tank won't listen, use your emergency cooldowns and try to heal through things, because the next boss you will be fighting is the hunter, and you don't really need big cooldowns on her. So I would just use your big cooldowns here and do your best, but just don't go left. I might even see an MDI strat that goes left if it turns out to be faster and good for percent, but I'm never going to recommend that you go left with your party unless they do something to nerf some of these mobs, because it's actually insane how much damage will go out. First, Elephant the Elephant. Honestly, with this boss, make sure you're just baiting Elephant to dash to a wall and not across the entire planet Earth when you can avoid it, and make sure the tank isn't tanking this boss in a lava puddle. Every time a tentacle grows, there's going to be a very heavy dot on the party. This is pretty heavy. Tell people to use defensives later, but it does have a hard cap of 5 tentacles, and I think that's 2 or 3 tentacle growths. So this does have sort of a cap on how difficult it can get, but sort of up to the DPS to murder the thing. You might need to tell your team to move in. I often find that players range me here all the time on every healer I've played, so be prepared to say that. I don't have a ton to say about the second boss, except make sure all 3 chains aren't broken at the same time, because that's way too much damage. And make sure absolutely no one dies with a chain up, because the chain goes missing, and then the tank will end up dealing like an unhealable dot to the party when you can't get the down phase. So be aware of that. Forge Master is a bit tough. There's 3 Forge hits to start the round of combat, and these hit quite hard. So use cooldowns accordingly. Then a couple players will be targeted, they'll be hit with something, and then they're going to have AoEs come out of them. This also applies a dot to them, so heal them up. However, there's a bit of a blessing here in that there's nothing going on for you for a little bit, as the tank eats a tank buster that is non-lethal. If they die to that, be worried about your tank. But heal people up and then start doing damage until it's time to start running around, because there should be random AoEs dropping after the weapon or whatever gets tossed into the lava. Right at the end of the AoE phase, you're going to have the 3 rounds of damage again. Repeat this until the boss dies. This boss is a bit heavy and a bit of a gear check, so be careful. The last boss of Neltharus is actually easier than you might think. There are little trinkets on the ground that you can pick up that are glimmering in these little sparkly piles. Pick them up and you get an item that you can channel while moving. This does insane damage to the shield in shield phase, so make sure you use it there, but be careful. One of the items will dash you towards the boss, so just be careful about that. Molten Gold is a really heavy dot that gets put on a single player. Make sure you heal them through accordingly, but honestly, dodge the swirlies, do damage where you can, and try to get through that shield phase as quickly as possible. There is a curse that's left on players that pick up an item. However, it's not too heavy, and unless you're extremely worried about the damage in that boss fight, you can even pick up a cursed item as a healer, and you should be totally fine. A curse dispel does help here and reduce some incoming damage. Freehold, I just want to talk about the boss fights, because as a healer, a bit of explanation here made my entire life a lot easier. First boss phases at 75%, but that first phase, they just randomly shoot targets. I've had to expend emergency cooldowns on this phase, because if somebody gets targeted 2 or 3 times in a row, they're just dead. It's a little hard to heal, but then the rest of the boss fight's kind of easy, because as long as players aren't stacking on top of each other for the gunshot mechanic, all you have to do is dispel and heal the person who got shot. You don't ever really have to worry about the tank. Dodge the bird and you're golden. The second boss, on the other hand, Eudora is the target you want to kill first. She does a jump, DBM will yell danger, danger, then she always fires from right to left from our perspective, or clockwise. Run to the left side of her and around her if you wish, and you can dodge all the gunshots. If you have to take a gunshot, press a defensive and use a movement ability and run into the gunshots, like to the right, not forward. And you should only take 1 tick. 1 tick is totally fine and very manageable, even on Tyrannical, but be careful, because anything more is generally fatal. The second boss in this boss fight is much easier to deal with. You know, don't stand in the circle, blah, 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 but when a barrel comes out, make sure that you're near the barrel. It is possible to dodge the barrel and it will go on the nearest target. You do not want this going on the tank. If the tank gets disoriented, the boss will start attacking random players. Once the barrel is on a player's head, murder the barrel as fast as you can in order to free the player. There are these blue swirlies on the ground though. These are actually buffs, so if you can absorb one of these blue swirlies, you absolutely should. The shark puncher is a little confusing. Sharks get tossed out and they fixate on the nearest target, generally the one that they're closest to when they first spawn. However, I have seen them be thrown at one person and then immediately turn and go after someone else. Try to kite them into a blood pile, they will eat the gore, and then they will continue moving on their way towards you. Eventually they despawn, or Shark Puncher will rearm and grab a shark. Just keep an eye on where Shark Puncher is, because he dashes in a straight line towards a shark to pick it up and then use it for an attack. As long as you don't get hit by this dash, you're totally fine. It puts a massive bleed on someone if it doesn't just kill you in the first place. And the final boss, there's not a lot to talk about, but the bleed that happens in phase 1 happens to everyone in phases 2 and 3. Just check the bleed. If it was non-lethal, chances are it's non-lethal for the party, and all you have to do is make sure everyone's topped off before the next round of daggers goes out. Dodge the mechanics here, heal people back to full, and you're chillin'. Neltharian's Lair's final boss is a little tough if you don't know it, but I promise you, it's pretty easy when a tank handles it well. Stack up nice and close to the tank. The tank shouldn't face any of the frontals towards any of you, and you guys will be able to bait shards just behind the tank. The tank will then rotate the boss. The enemy spawns to the left of the boss, or right from the player's perspective, and the tank can position the boss in such a way that the mob will hopefully spawn directly on the shard, stunning them the moment they spawn. This cancels their ability and lets them do absolutely nothing for a little bit, so you guys can burst down the ad and then get back to doing damage to the boss. If the ad or the boss has to walk for an extended period of time, they'll actually do AoE damage to the raid. This is what generally gets my cooldowns out of me more than anything, so just keep an eye on it. After the big scary attack that you have to hide behind the shard for, there's going to be some lava plumes that come out and damage players. This is when you actually have to start healing and being really careful on this fight. However, it shouldn't be like an unhealable amount of damage anymore since the nerfs. I found it to be pretty easy to heal through, but this is when you need to really be paying attention to the heals. However, the tank is a lot of this fight, and I don't generally see tanks struggle with this mechanic anymore, so hopefully most of them know it. On lower levels, you might need to tell the tank to do this, and I'm sure it can get a little messy. That's going to do it for this video. I hope the tips helped. I have a lot more coming, so stay tuned. But thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.